Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're putting on our literary critic hats to analyze a really fascinating intersection of history, law, and literature. We're going to look at how legal labels, physical displacement, and rigid administrative systems totally shape the identity and the poetry of Mahmoud Darwish. For any student of literature or history, Darwish is an absolute titan. But to really get his work, we actually have to understand the paperwork that defined his early life.
So, here's our game plan. We'll start with roots under the mandate, move into the present-absent paradox, and then look at the poem as a primary source. After that, we'll dive into subverting bureaucratic language, explore his exile and philosophical shifts, and finally, do a quick student comprehension check to lock it all in. Let's just jump right into it.
Starting with Section 1, Roots under the Mandate, Historical Context. To truly understand the poet, we've got to understand the historical foundation of his childhood.
Darwish was born in 1941 in the village of Al-Birwa in Galilee, which at the time was under the British Mandate. But the absolute pivotal year here is 1948. When the 1948 war broke out and the State of Israel was established, an event Palestinians call the Nakba, or catastrophe, Darwish was just 7 years old. Imagine being 7 and experiencing that kind of sudden, forced displacement as your family flees to Lebanon to escape the fighting. Eventually, his family managed to secretly return to the newly formed State of Israel, but what they found was just devastating. Their village had been completely demolished, and new settlements were built right in its place.
Moving on to Part 2, the present-absent paradox, administrative control. This brings us to a crucial legal mechanism that forever changed how Darwish understood belonging.
It's a concept that sounds kind of like a riddle, but it had very real consequences. We're talking about the present-absent paradox. In terms of sheer lived reality, Darwish and his family were physically present, right? They were standing right there in the land of his birth. But because they had fled during the war, the state legally categorized them as absentees. So they officially became present absentees. This whole bureaucratic redefinition meant that while Darwish was physically there, he was legally considered absent. And that legally authorized the state to reassign his family's property. He learned super early on that ownership and dispossession were basically carried out through documents and administrative jargon.
The crucial takeaway here is that his everyday reality was entirely boxed in by paperwork. Living as a Palestinian Arab citizen inside Israel meant living under a strict military administration up until 1966. And what did that mean for just, getting around? It meant ordinary life was intensely regulated by documentation. Seriously, imagine needing a permit just to cross an invisible line to the next village over. Curfews could drop without any warning. Political gatherings were heavily monitored, and mandatory identity cards had to be shown constantly. Identity wasn't just who you were in your heart, it was a highly regulated administrative category.
All right, Section 3, the poem as primary source, analyzing identity card. Let's look at our central text and see exactly how Darwish channeled this intensely regulated reality right into his literature. Now, as students and literary critics, we aren't just reading poetry today for its aesthetic beauty. We're treating Darwish's famous poem Identity Card as a literal primary source. That means we're reading it as a historical document. It condenses the complex history of surveillance, structural marginalization, and conditional citizenship into one single, highly dramatic, bureaucratic exchange between a marginalized subject and state authority.
Just listen to the poem's opening command. Write down, "I am an Arab." The repetition in this piece is wild. The speaker is standing before an authority figure, an official who holds the power to approve or deny his very existence. And Darwish takes that cold, bureaucratic necessity of recording identity and completely flips it into a forceful, defiant assertion of presence. He literally turns the interrogation right back onto the interrogator.
Which brings us nicely to Part 4, Subverting Bureaucratic Language, the Power of Poetry. You can really feel the tension in Darwish's early work between those rigid systems and the highly expressive language he used to fight back.
He cleverly harnessed the rich influence of classical Arabic poetry to totally subvert the institutional language of his oppressors, where the bureaucracy used dry jargon, numbers, categories, legal labels, and permits. Darwish fired back with profound poetic Arabic. He grounded his early political expression in ancestral roots, the dignity of physical labor, and historical continuity. By doing this, he was basically asserting, hey, my identity is way deeper and way older than any permit you can stamp on a piece of paper. Section 5, Exile and Philosophical Shifts, Language as Territory. As Darwish's life progressed, his geographical reality, and consequently his poetic themes, shifted big time. The boy who is a present absentee would soon become an exile. Let's trace out this path of forced movement. Facing house arrests for his political poetry, Darwish eventually left Israel in the late 1960s, and this kicked off a life of long exile. It took him first to Cairo and later to Beirut, which was a huge hub for Palestinian intellectual life at the time. There, he acted as an editor for some really important PLO literary journals. Eventually, his journey pushed him even further abroad to places like Tunisia, Paris, and beyond. This constant movement really transformed him into the ultimate poet of the diaspora.
So how did this constant exile build a distinct arc in his body of work? Well, his early themes were all about direct political confrontation, criticizing discrimination, pushing back against that bureaucratic friction we talked about. But as he lived longer in exile, his themes shifted. The poetry became much broader, much more reflective. He started adopting a really philosophical lens, exploring these grand universal themes of love, mortality, the mechanics of memory, and the passage of time.
And honestly, this leads us to perhaps the most beautiful and poignant realization of Darwish's life. He often described himself as belonging to language rather than territory. When the actual physical borders of his homeland were entirely inaccessible to him, he redefined his sense of belonging. Poetic language itself stepped in as a literal substitute for his lost physical territory. He essentially built a nation out of words. How incredible is that?
Okay, Section 6, Student Comprehension Check, Reviewing the Administrative Impact. Before we wrap up this explainer, let's put our student hats back on for a second. I want to make absolutely sure you're walking away with a solid grasp of how administrative systems shaped this history.
Here's question 1 for you. How did the paradoxical present-absent legal label impact Darwish's childhood connection to his family's property? Take a second to think about it. Remember how legal documents were utilized here. Despite his physical presence in the newly formed state, that specific label was the administrative tool used to legally reassign his family's land.
Moving on to question 2. Can you identify 3 specific bureaucratic mechanisms used during the 1948 to 1966 military rule to restrict the daily mobility of Palestinians? Got 'em? You might have thought of the mandatory travel permits between villages, the sudden curfews, the constant monitoring of political gatherings, or, of course, those ever-present identity cards that heavily influenced his early poetry. And finally, question 3. In what way did Darwish's forced movement to cities like Cairo and Beirut redefine his understanding of a homeland? Think back to his shift toward philosophical writing. As he moved from nation to nation, he really positioned language and the creation of poetry as his ultimate place of belonging when physical borders were closed.
I want to leave you with one final, totally provocative thought, drawing a bit on the theories of Gayatri Spivak. In the poem we discussed, the speaker speaks loudly and forcefully, right? But the physical identity card still remains in the official's hand. The power dynamic doesn't just instantly vanish. So we really have to ask ourselves, while Darwish brilliantly reclaimed his identity through poetry, do words of resistance actually have the power to dismantle a bureaucracy? Or do they simply expose it, ensuring that the human spirit survives it? It's a profound question about the actual limits of literature, and it's one I really hope you continue to ponder long after this explainer ends. Thanks so much for hanging out with me.